Imagine this, a quiet Thursday night, a young programmer in his small apartment, buried in work. But then, a crash of violent disruption that shatters the mundane and introduces him to something beyond comprehension. What happens when an alien emissary, stranded on Earth, crosses paths with a human in the most unexpected of ways? An unexplainable connection forms between them, one that defies logic and physics. As they struggle to repair a broken spaceship, their bond grows, powerful and uncontrollable, pulling them toward each other in ways neither of them can fully understand. Welcome to Galactic Conundrums, where the mysteries of the universe unfold, and the unimaginable becomes reality. Tonight, we embark on an extraordinary journey, one that challenges the very limits of what we believe to be possible. Will they survive the forces of the cosmos, or will this extraordinary connection pull them apart? Join us as we explore an encounter that's out of this world, where love, mystery, and adventure intertwine across the stars. Buckle up, because the universe is about to get a lot more complicated. This is the beginning of an intergalactic journey like no other, one that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the cosmos. The room was cloaked in a dull glow of flickering screens. Ethan Brooks sat hunched over his cluttered desk in his small, one-bedroom apartment, his fingers dancing over the keyboard in the quiet solitude of the night. The soft hum of outdated electronics echoed through the space, the gentle buzz of his ancient computer a constant companion. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the faint, metallic tang of solder from his ongoing projects. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that felt like any other, a quiet, predictable pause in the cycle of his life. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance, casting long, fleeting shadows that danced across the walls of his apartment. The usual hum of urban life, the distant sounds of car engines, the soft murmur of people in the streets faded into a strange silence, broken only by the occasional beep of his devices. But that night, as Ethan's mind wandered through lines of code, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a strange tension that he couldn't place. It lingered, barely perceptible, like the calm before a storm. Then, it came. A loud crash tore through the stillness of the room. It sounded like the world itself had broken, shattering into 1,000 pieces. Ethan's heart leapt into his throat, his pulse racing as his eyes snapped up from his screen. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, holding its breath. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with anticipation. His chair scraped sharply against the floor as he leapt to his feet, his mind reeling with wild thoughts of intruders or worse. His feet barely made a sound as he moved toward the source of the disturbance, the living room. The apartment, though small, felt like a maze in that moment, the walls closing in as he walked. Each step echoed through the empty space, his breathing heavy as he drew closer. And then, he stopped. There, amid a sea of broken glass and overturned furniture, lay a figure, a woman. Her body seemed to glow with an ethereal light, her skin faintly shimmering in a dim room as though dusted with stardust. Her long hair cascaded like liquid silver, shimmering in the soft light, sparkling with every movement as if she were woven from the very fabric of the stars. At first, Ethan thought his mind was playing tricks on him, some trick of the light or a fleeting hallucination. But then, her eyes fluttered open. Those eyes, they were unlike anything he had ever seen. A deep, hypnotic purple, glowing faintly in a dim room, they seemed to pierce through the darkness, searching, knowing, and yet completely foreign. First meeting. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. His gaze swept over the figure in front of him, trying to comprehend the impossible. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, his throat tight with disbelief. Who are you?" he stammered, the words catching in his mouth. The woman groaned softly, sitting up with difficulty, her movements slow and graceful, despite her apparent disorientation. Her gaze swept the room, her eyes wide, before finally settling on him. For a moment, there was silence, an eternity suspended in time. Then, she spoke, her voice soft yet filled with a strange, melodic cadence that seemed to echo in his mind. You're human." The words hung in the air, laced with both curiosity and alarm. Ethan, still too stunned to speak, took a step closer, his heart hammering in his chest. Yes, I am. But, what are you doing in my apartment?" He couldn't wrap his mind around it. Nothing about this made sense. The woman's expression shifted, her brow furrowing as she slowly shook her head, her silver hair flowing around her like a cascade of light. She seemed to be sorting through her thoughts, trying to make sense of something much larger than the moment itself. "I am Lyra Vantor," she said, her voice steadying, though a trace of frustration lingered. "Emissary of the Zarian Empire. I was on a diplomatic mission, but something went wrong." She paused, wincing as she touched her forehead, the faint glow around her flickering. "I must have crashed. This is bad. Really bad." Ethan blinked, the reality of her words barely registering. His mind scrambled to process the impossible. An alien? A representative of some far-off empire? He opened his mouth, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. He tried again, his voice unsteady. "Wait, slow down. You're an alien." His voice was tinged with disbelief, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in her eyes. Lyra sighed, her expression turning slightly annoyed, as if the answer were painfully obvious. "Obviously," she replied, her voice tinged with both frustration and something that almost sounded like embarrassment. "And now I'm stuck here, in your primitive human city, with no way to fix my ship or contact my people." Ethan stood there, unable to tear his eyes away from her, the pieces of the night starting to fall into place or shatter into something completely new. A spaceship. A crash. And now, an alien stranded in his living room. Lyra sat carefully on the edge of the couch, her glowing skin dimming slightly in the quiet, as if the intense radiance had receded just a little with her words. She seemed far more fragile now, despite her ethereal appearance. The shimmer around her was no longer as intense, her expression pensive, as if trying to piece together her thoughts from the chaos that had unfolded. Her eyes, still a glowing purple, softened as they met Ethan's, her gaze searching him, attempting to gauge if he could understand the gravity of what she was about to say. Her voice, when she spoke again, had a far more serious edge. I am from the Zarian Empire, she began, her tone steady, though there was an undercurrent of frustration that bubbled beneath. I was sent here on a diplomatic mission. We were supposed to establish peaceful relations with your people. But she trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to banish the dark thoughts that began to cloud her mind. She stood and began to pace slowly, as if the room, despite its small size, could not contain the weight of the story she needed to tell. Every step seemed deliberate, her movements almost mechanical, as if she were still calibrating herself to the strange environment. The faint glow from her skin flickered in sync with her changing emotions, casting ghostly reflections across the walls of the apartment. My ship, she continued, her voice lowering, it was damaged. A malfunction during our hyperspace jump. It wasn't supposed to happen. We have fail-safes, contingencies for everything. But something went wrong. She paused, looking directly at Ethan as though daring him to question the veracity of her words. Ethan watched, mesmerized by the depth of her expression, trying to fathom the magnitude of what she was revealing. His heart pounded, and his mind raced, yet a strange calm settled over him, as though his own instinct was telling him to listen, to believe, to help. Lyra's hands trembled as she continued, despite the confidence in her voice. The emergency teleportation device was activated to save us, to avoid a crash. But I didn't have control over where I ended up. She sighed deeply. It seems fate or something far stranger decided that your home would be the right destination. Her words lingered in the air, like an incantation that shifted the very atmosphere in the room. Her eyes flickered with emotion, betraying the vulnerability she'd tried to hide. She was stranded, alone, and completely at the mercy of a world that she didn't understand. Ethan swallowed, trying to make sense of it all. His mind was reeling, his logical mind at odds with the surreal reality of the situation. He struggled to push aside the disbelief clawing at him, focusing instead on what Lyra had just shared. So, you're telling me that your ship malfunctioned, and you ended up here? In my apartment. Lyra's lips tightened as she nodded. Yes. And now, I can't communicate with my people. The ship is severely damaged, and I am stuck. There was a long pause before Ethan spoke again, the weight of her words sinking in. Despite the terror rising in his chest, he knew he had no choice but to help her. There was no turning back from this moment. He took a deep breath, his mind grappling with the impossibility of it all, before stepping forward. Ethan offers help. I don't know anything about alien technology, but... Ethan's voice faltered for a second. He looked at the broken pieces of her ship scattered around the apartment and then met Lyra's gaze. Her eyes were searching, but there was also an edge of skepticism, a wariness that told him she didn't trust him, couldn't trust him. Not fully, anyway. He paused for a long moment, wondering what drove him to speak the next words. The logical part of him screamed at him to walk away, to call someone, anyone who might be able to help. But something deeper inside him urged him to stay, to take the risk. His gaze hardened with resolve. "I'll help you fix it." Lyra's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in her posture that only someone paying close attention could notice. She looked at him, her lips pursing slightly in disbelief, her eyes narrowed in uncertainty. "You?" she asked, her voice laced with an edge of disbelief. "How can you help me? You're just human." Ethan felt a strange mix of offense and determination rise in him. He stood tall, the weight of her doubt settling on his shoulders, but he didn't let it deter him. "I may not understand your technology, but I'm good with gadgets. Computers, machinery. I can figure things out." He was almost pleading with her, trying to show her that his own unique skills could be useful, that he wasn't as helpless as she might think. For a moment, Lyra said nothing. Her expression softened slightly, as though contemplating his words. She took a long, slow breath, and a soft glow around her flickered again, brighter this time, as though she was weighing her options. Finally, she nodded, her voice low but firm. "Fine. I'll let you help. But know this, human." She met his gaze, her eyes gleaming like twin stars in a dim room. "If you mess up, the consequences will be far worse than you can imagine." Ethan gulped, the tension in the room palpable. His heart raced, but something deep within him, some quiet, determined part of his mind was resolved to see this through. "I'll do my best," he said simply. Lyra turned her back on him briefly, glancing at the broken pieces of her ship scattered across the room. "We don't have much time," she muttered to herself. "The longer I'm here, the more dangerous this becomes for both of us." Ethan stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. His hands trembled, but his resolve was firm. Whatever the cost, he was about to dive into the unknown. The room, now transformed into a makeshift workshop, was filled with an odd mixture of technology, old, familiar gadgets scattered across Ethan's cluttered desk, now meshed with foreign, glowing components that hummed with energy unlike anything he had ever seen. Lyra stood near the center of the room, carefully sorting through the wreckage of her spacecraft, her silver hair shimmering under the harsh light of the desk lamp. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he approached the wreckage. He couldn't help but be mesmerized by the alien technology laid out before him. The ship's parts looked like they had been sculpted by a mind far beyond human understanding. Metallic pieces, sleek and fluid in design, hummed with an energy that vibrated through the air. Each part seemed to pulse with life of its own. The ship's surface, though battered and scarred from the crash, still held an otherworldly beauty, its once smooth contours now cracked, like the surface of a shattered crystal. Ethan's fingers brushed against a fragment of the hull, and a soft, almost musical tone vibrated through his fingertips. He quickly pulled his hand back, as if the sensation had startled him. The ship was alive in a way he couldn't begin to comprehend. Lyra was working silently, a series of small tools in her hands that seemed to bend and shift as they moved, almost as if they were extensions of her own will. She pressed one of the tools against a small, glowing panel embedded in the wreckage, and the panel flickered to life, revealing a complex pattern of interwoven circuits and energy pathways. Ethan watched in awe, unable to suppress the fascination that gripped him. How is that even possible? Ethan muttered under his breath, as he observed the technology that seemed to defy every principle of engineering he knew. The lines of code and circuits flashed in patterns he couldn't decipher, the materials themselves unlike any metal or composite he'd ever encountered. Lyra glanced up, her purple eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. "It's Zarian technology," she explained, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of sadness. "Far beyond your understanding, I'm afraid. We've spent centuries perfecting it. But..." She paused, the weight of her situation sinking in. "It doesn't matter now. It's broken." Ethan nodded, still trying to come to terms with the idea that he was standing in the middle of a broken alien ship. "I mean, I'll try," he said, more to himself than to her. He pulled his mind back to the task at hand, determined to help her. But as he reached for a delicate component, he realized how out of his depth he was. The tools he'd brought to the table seemed like child's play in comparison to the sophisticated technology around him. The task was daunting, and the clock was ticking. As the hours dragged on, the frustration in the air began to build. Ethan worked tirelessly, his mind racing to connect the pieces of technology before him, but the more he worked, the clearer it became that he was facing a challenge far beyond his abilities. The alien devices resisted his every attempt to manipulate them, each effort met with glowing resistance, as if the technology itself was rejecting him. Lyra paced back and forth, her silver suit glimmering as she moved. Her movements were sharp, quick, her tension growing with every passing second. Ethan could see the worry etched across her face, despite her calm exterior. She was trying to hide her anxiety, but it was impossible to ignore the way her hands trembled as she worked on her side of the ship. "We're running out of time," she muttered, her voice strained. "The Galactic Council will find me soon. They have eyes everywhere. If they track my location..." She trailed off, her voice tight with fear. Ethan looked up, his own anxiety rising at the thought. "But you said your people would come for you, right? I mean, surely they'll..." Lyra interrupted him, her voice rising slightly, her expression darkening. "You don't understand. If the Council finds me here, they'll erase everything. Everything. They'll obliterate any trace of my presence, including you." Her eyes locked onto his, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. "They won't hesitate. The thought of being erased, wiped from existence, sent a chill crawling up Ethan's spine. His hands paused in mid-motion as he looked at her, truly understanding the stakes for the first time. Lyra wasn't just worried about getting back to her people, she was fighting for her very survival. And now, she was pulling him into that fight whether he was ready or not. I won't let that happen, Ethan stammered, his voice shaking with resolve. We'll fix this. I'll help you, I swear. But even as the words left his mouth, doubt crept in. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a fighter. All he had was his determination, and that didn't seem like nearly enough to keep them both alive. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Her eyes softened for a moment, the flickering light in the room casting strange shadows across her face. She exhaled sharply, her breath catching in her chest. You don't understand, she said softly, almost to herself. I never meant for you to get involved in this. I never meant for you to be in danger. Her voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure, as though reminding herself of the gravity of her mission. Ethan wanted to say something, anything to ease her fear, but the weight of the situation was too overwhelming. The ship was broken. Her people were millions of light years away. And now, somehow, he had become the last hope she had. A strange silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of alien technology and the distant sound of Ethan's breathing. He could feel the pressure mounting, the anxiety in Lyra's every movement, and the unspoken terror hanging between them. If they didn't succeed, the consequences would be unimaginable. The night stretched on, and the clock kept ticking. The days had begun to blur together in a haze of strained concentration and the incessant hum of alien machinery. Ethan and Lyra worked side by side, often in silence, their minds focused on the ship's repairs and the looming threat of discovery. But the air between them had shifted, charged, thick with something neither of them could name, but both could feel. It started small at first, a lingering glance, a shared silence that wasn't uncomfortable but strangely comforting. Ethan found himself noticing the way the light reflected in Lyra's silvery hair, the way her movements seemed to flow with an almost otherworldly grace. There was something about her that tugged at him, something deeper than mere fascination. He had always considered himself a logical person, a man of reason, but this was different. He couldn't explain it, and he didn't know how to control it. Lyra, too, could sense the shift in the space between them. At first, she tried to ignore it, pushing her feelings aside to focus on the task at hand. But it was impossible to ignore the growing warmth that seemed to coil in her chest every time Ethan spoke, every time their eyes met. The bond between them, something she had never experienced before, was undeniable, and it was becoming stronger by the day. One evening, as they worked together in the soft light of the apartment, Lyra paused, her hand resting on the edge of a broken console. Her fingers trembled slightly, a subtle reaction that didn't go unnoticed by Ethan. You feel it too, don't you? Lyra's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. The words were spoken with the weight of something unspoken, something fragile she hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. She turned to face him, her eyes dark, the faint purple glow within them pulsing in time with her emotions. Ethan froze. He had known something was changing, but hearing her say it out loud was different. His breath caught in his throat, his hands faltering on the ship's panel before him. He tried to brush it off, but the truth was undeniable. Something had been happening between them, something that went far beyond mere proximity. It was as if they were tethered by invisible threads that pulled them together, tangled their emotions, and refused to let go. Lyra let out a breath, the tension in her body palpable. "I can't explain it," she admitted softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness of the room. "My biology, my Zarian biology is reacting to you. It's overwhelming. I can feel everything more intensely. My emotions, my thoughts, they are all tangled up in this connection." Ethan's eyes widened, his heart pounding as he processed her words. The idea of this powerful, alien force was beyond his understanding, but he could see it in the way she looked at him. The way her skin shimmered just slightly whenever they were close. There was something undeniable in the way their presence seemed to affect each other. "I never thought something like this could happen," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't fight it anymore." She shook her head slightly, as if the words themselves felt foreign on her tongue. "I don't know what it means, but I feel like I'm being pulled toward you, and I can't stop it." Her confession hung in the air between them, thick with the weight of her emotions. Ethan took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling in a sea of confusion. Part of him wanted to step away from it all, to distance himself from the growing attraction and the dangerous complexity of it. But another part of him, something deeper, something primal, was drawn to her. Her vulnerability, her strength, her beauty, it was all too much to ignore. Ethan hesitated for a long moment, his mind wrestling with the chaos of his emotions. He had spent his life running from complications, keeping things simple, logical. But there was nothing simple about what was happening between him and Lyra. He could feel the pull, the connection that seemed to seep into his very being, and it terrified him. "I don't know how to deal with this," he said, his voice strained. "I've never felt anything like this before." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing slowly as he tried to collect his thoughts. You're not just someone from another world. You're changing everything I thought I knew about myself." Lyra's gaze softened, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm sorry," she whispered, as though apologizing for something beyond her control, something that neither of them could explain. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Ethan's chest tightened at the sight of her, standing there in the glow of the room, looking like something between a dream and a nightmare. His heart raced, his thoughts a blur as he tried to understand the strange connection between them. He wanted to push it away, to deny it. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. "I don't know if I can just walk away from this," he admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. He had never been one to open up, to let his emotions take control. But here, with Lyra, everything was different. Lyra stepped closer, her presence filling the room, her energy pulling at him in a way he couldn't resist. "I don't want you to walk away," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the steady hum of the ship's broken machinery. "I don't want to be alone in this." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he finally turned to face her fully. Her eyes, glowing softly in a dim room, seemed to see right through him, reading his thoughts, his fears, his desires. The tension between them was unbearable, and yet, it felt strangely right. "Then what do we do?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and longing. Lyra's gaze never left his, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of their breathing and the soft pulse of energy in the room. Her hand reached out, barely grazing his, and the touch sent a jolt of warmth through him, as though the very air between them had shifted. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice a mix of wonder and uncertainty. "But maybe, we face it together." In that moment, neither of them could deny it anymore. The connection between them was real. It was undeniable. And despite the fear, the uncertainty, and the dangers that lay ahead, they both knew one thing for certain: their bond had only just begun. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with a strange energy that seemed to hum just beneath the surface, vibrating with something unspoken. Lyra sat on the couch, her silver hair clinging to her forehead as beads of sweat glistened against her glowing skin. Her body was trembling no longer from the shock of the crash or the strain of repairs but from an intensity that was completely out of her control. Ethan noticed the change in her almost immediately. The air around her seemed to shimmer, her once calm aura now radiating heat, like a furnace that was on the verge of melting everything around it. Her breathing was shallow, her chest rising and falling with each unsteady breath. The iridescent glow of her skin, which had once been a soft, ethereal shimmer, now pulsed erratically, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. Her hands gripped the edge of the couch, knuckles pale against the fabric, her fingertips twitching as if she were trying to hold herself together. Her eyes were wide, the usual calming purple glow now streaked with veins of fiery red, the intensity of her emotions seeping through the very essence of her being. "It's happening again," Lyra muttered, her voice strained, as if the words themselves were a struggle to form. She tried to rise, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her back onto the couch. Ethan rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched her struggle. Her body was burning. He could feel the heat radiating off her like a wave of intense energy, and it was growing stronger by the second. She gasped, her breath catching as if every inhale was a battle. Her skin was feverishly hot to the touch, yet her eyes, those haunting, mesmerizing eyes, seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly mix of panic and desperation. I can't control it," she whispered, her voice barely a whisper, as though the words were stolen from her by the intensity of her own emotions. "My body, it's reacting to you, Ethan. It's too much." Ethan's throat tightened as he watched her, helplessness creeping into his chest. There was nothing in his experience that could explain what was happening. The logical part of him screamed to find a solution, to stop the spiraling chaos, but the more he tried to grasp the situation, the less he understood. Lyra's body arched involuntarily, and a soft gasp escaped her lips, as though she were in pain. Her hands clutched at the fabric of her suit, tugging at it as if it were the only thing grounding her. The heat in the room seemed to intensify with every passing second, pressing in from all sides. "Lyra," Ethan said, his voice thick with concern. "We need to find a way to help you. This can't keep happening." The silence between them hung heavy for a moment, broken only by the soft sound of Lyra's breathing and the distant hum of the broken ship's machinery. Ethan stood frozen, his mind racing through every possible solution he could think of, but none seemed adequate. What was happening to Lyra was beyond his comprehension, and it was becoming increasingly clear that it wasn't something they could just fix with technology. Lyra's hand reached out toward him, her fingers trembling as she brushed against his arm. Her touch was electric, sending a pulse of heat through his skin that left him breathless. "Ethan, I don't know what's happening to me. It's as if my body can't hold on anymore. The bond between us, it's too much." He could see the fear in her eyes now, raw and unguarded. This wasn't just about repairing her ship or getting her home. It was about survival. Her survival. And, in a way, his own. This connection between them had become something more than either of them could understand, and now, it was threatening to overwhelm them both. Ethan's mind raced as the weight of her words hit him. She wasn't just struggling with her ship's malfunction, she was struggling with something far deeper, something tied to their very bond. And if they didn't figure out a way to face it, to control it, they both risked losing themselves to it. His gaze met hers, and in that moment, a strange clarity washed over him. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even understand what was happening. But there was one thing he knew for certain: they had to stop fighting it. They had to face it head on. "We can't keep pushing this down," Ethan said, his voice quieter now, filled with an unspoken resolve. "This bond, whatever it is, it's not going away. We can't keep pretending it's not there." His hands trembled slightly as he reached out to her, brushing his fingers lightly against her burning skin. "Maybe the only way to stop this is to stop fighting it. Let it run its course." Lyra stared at him, her white eyes reflecting a mix of disbelief and something else, something softer, as if she had been waiting for him to say those very words. The flickering heat around her body seemed to stabilize for a moment, a slight calm settling over her, as if the idea of embracing the bond had given her a sense of peace. "I don't know what it means," Lyra whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "but I think you're right. I can't keep fighting it. I can't keep running from it." Ethan's heart raced in his chest as he slowly closed the distance between them, the pull between them growing more magnetic, more intense with every passing second. As his hand gently cupped her face, he could feel the heat radiating from her, a warmth that seemed to burn through the very fabric of his own being. And yet, despite the intensity, there was something undeniably beautiful about it, something that felt right. Lyra's breath hitched, and she closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "We don't understand it," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "but we have to face it, Ethan. Together." For a moment, they simply stood there, caught in the unspoken understanding between them, the tension of their connection reaching a boiling point. And as their gazes met once again, Ethan realized that whatever was happening between them was beyond their control. But they could face it together, no matter what it meant. The makeshift workshop, once a chaotic jumble of broken technology and alien machinery, now stood in a strange, uneasy silence. The repairs had been completed. Lyra's ship, though battered, was ready to leave. It stood, gleaming faintly, in a small clearing near Ethan's apartment. Its sleek, metallic surface reflected the soft light of the evening, now calm after days of intense work. Lyra stood beside the ship, her face somber as she adjusted her suit, a quiet resignation settling over her. She was no longer the woman who had crashed into Ethan's life in such a bewildering way. She was different now, stronger, yet marked by the experience of their shared journey. Ethan stood just a few feet away, his hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his jacket, his heart heavier than he ever expected it to be. It was happening. She was leaving. The weight of that knowledge settled over him like an anchor. I have to go." Lyra's voice broke the silence, soft and steady, yet tinged with sorrow. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to speak the words that had been looming over both of them. Ethan nodded, though his chest tightened with every passing moment. He had known this day would come, but knowing it and feeling it were two entirely different things. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra turned to him, her gaze softening. "Ethan, before I leave, I need you to understand something." Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, her eyes catching his, pulling him into the gravity of her words. "The bond we share, it's permanent. It cannot be broken, no matter how far apart we are. No matter where I go, you will always be with me. And I will always be with you." The truth of her words struck Ethan like a thunderbolt. His heart skipped a beat, his breath catching in his throat as the enormity of what she was saying washed over him. This wasn't just some fleeting connection. It wasn't a passing thing. It was real. It was a tie that would transcend time and space. "You're not alone in this, Ethan," Lyra continued, her voice almost a whisper, the soft glow around her intensifying as if it, too, was a reflection of her emotions. "No matter the distance, no matter where I am in the universe, this connection, this bond, will remain. It will never fade. You'll always be a part of me." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for something, anything to hold on to. He reached out, his hand trembling as he cupped her cheek, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. "I won't forget you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't ever forget you, Lyra." Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the depth of their connection. The softest of smiles touched her lips, though it was heavy with the weight of their parting. "I know," she said quietly. "And I won't forget you either." The silence between them was heavy, almost sacred. The air seemed to shimmer, like a spell woven around them, as if time itself had paused, holding its breath for just a moment longer. Finally, Lyra took a step back, her hand lingering on his for a fraction of a second before she withdrew. "I have to go now," she said, her voice a little strained, as though the words were harder to say than she'd imagined. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, his chest tight, but he nodded. "I'll wait for you. I'll always be here." She didn't answer, but the unspoken promise between them was clear. Without another word, Lyra turned and walked toward her ship, her movements graceful and purposeful, the glow around her fading as she approached the sleek vessel. As she boarded the ship, Ethan's eyes lingered on her, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. She paused at the entrance, looking back at him one last time. Their gazes met, and in that instant, the unbreakable bond between them felt like an anchor binding them together, no matter the vastness of the universe between them. With a final, lingering look, Lyra entered the ship, and the door sealed behind her. The engines hummed to life, the faint sound vibrating through the air, like the heartbeat of a distant star. The ship slowly lifted off the ground, rising into the night sky, its silver hull gleaming in the light of the moon. Ethan stood frozen, his hand reaching out as if to grasp something intangible, something he couldn't keep. The ship hovered for a brief moment before shooting upward into the stars, disappearing into the endless expanse of space. The days that followed felt like a strange, empty void. Ethan returned to his apartment, his life once again filled with the hum of electronics and the silence of solitude, but everything had changed. The quiet was heavier now, the absence of Lyra's presence leaving an ache in his chest that he couldn't shake. He went through the motions, repairing gadgets, writing code, but his thoughts always wandered back to her. The connection they shared, the bond was still there, a constant warmth in the back of his mind, like a whisper that never faded. And then, one evening, something changed. A warmth spread through Ethan's chest, unlike anything he had felt before. It started as a soft flutter, a heat building from deep within. He stopped what he was doing, his breath catching in his throat. The sensation was familiar, yet foreign at the same time, like the presence of something or someone that had always been with him, just waiting to return. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest as the warmth intensified. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an explanation, but nothing made sense. Then, in a flash of light, it happened. The room seemed to warp, the air vibrating with energy as a soft glow filled the space. Ethan blinked, his eyes widening in disbelief as a figure materialized before him, a figure he knew all too well. Lyra stood there, no longer the woman he had said goodbye to, but someone different, someone more radiant, more powerful. Her eyes glowed with a strength that matched the fire inside her. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, her presence filling the room with a warmth that took Ethan's breath away. "Ethan," Lyra's voice was steady, her smile soft but filled with certainty. "I'm back." Ethan's heart raced as he stepped toward her, disbelief and joy flooding his chest in equal measure. "But how?" he managed to ask, his voice trembling with emotion. Lyra's smile deepened, her gaze never leaving his. "The bond between us is stronger than I ever realized. No matter how far I went, I could always find my way back to you." Her hand reached out, her fingers brushing against his, sending a pulse of warmth through him. "And now, I'm not leaving again. We'll continue this journey together, no matter where the stars take us." In that moment, Ethan knew it was true. No matter where they went, no matter what challenges lay ahead, their connection was unbreakable. And so, together, they would journey across the universe, knowing that no distance, no time, no force in the cosmos could ever tear them apart. The connection between them had transcended everything. It was more than just fate, it was a love that spanned the stars. And as they stepped into the unknown, one question remained: how far could love and destiny really go? But here's the real question: if you could form a bond like that with someone across galaxies, across worlds, would you embrace it, or would you run from the unknown? The universe is vast, and sometimes, the greatest mysteries aren't out there in the stars, they are in the connections we make along the way. What do you think? Could a connection like theirs really happen? Or is it just the stuff of science fiction? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what you'd do if you were in Ethan's shoes. Don't forget to subscribe to Galactic Conundrums for more mysteries that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the universe. Until next time, keep looking up, the truth is out there.